Welcome to the next lecture in BAAS 3020, Fundamentals of Inquiry and Discovery, and this time we're looking at Module 7, the importance of sampling. Here's another fun photograph of mine. This is a favorite. I was hiking through France on something called Le Puy Brut, which is a connector to the Camino de Santiago in Spain. Adventure is important to me, and stepping outside of my life has really been very valuable to me, and it's kind of given me perspective. The first long hike I did was about a month long, and I decided to leave corporate America. I was then a chief marketing officer and go back and get my degrees to become a professor. But this is in a town called Condom, France. Yes, you heard that right, Condom, France. I have a picture in front of the sign because it's just so damn funny. But evidently this is where the musketeers were from, and so that's me, the fifth musketeer there. This was about a 35-day hike through France. Excellent food. If you're ever looking for an interesting way to travel cheaply in Europe, Google the Camino Santiago, and there's hundreds of routes through Europe. And the nice part about it is the lodgings are very inexpensive. The routes are well marked, so you don't need a lot of technology, and you do it on foot or by bicycle. Some people do it by car, but to me it was so much more fun to do it on foot. The first one was a bit overwhelming because I was fearful I couldn't do it, but you're just walking. So the nice part is when you're doing something like this for a month long, the stress just goes away because your only decisions are where to eat and where to sleep because the road is marked. So let's get on with the lecture. In Module 7, we're going to continue in our textbooks 100 questions, looking at questions number 8 through 32. We're going to continue reading in our book 52 Things. We're going to read chapters 18 through 24. Now, they use the word chapters, but of course these are just simple concepts, much like 100 questions. So each chapter is a page, maybe two. Inside of Canvas, we have a number of articles and information to convey to you. Another glossary on sampling, some information about sampling, what is sampling, some statistic concepts, looking at reliability and validity, an example for creating a representative sample, differentiating between probability and non-probability sampling. They're really short articles, but you may be on information overload, so checking those out may make this a lot more clear. And then there's some more additional materials, not so important by the time you hit them because you probably have it. You can see that there's another what is sampling video, but they're very short, and so if scan them. Scan the additional materials, and if you already got the information, you're fine. In this module, you of course have a module quiz based upon what I've just talked about, and then discussion number 3 begins on Monday. Our first readings and material for Module 7 is from 100 questions, and it's in Part 2, addressing ethical concerns. What are the main ethical concerns of research? Most of the ethical concerns about research started from medical research to make sure we weren't hurting people. However, all research is expected to do no harm to human subjects. The ethics areas that are identified in this question are around research subjects, also about the data, and then also how you present findings. And so it's both about how we're treating the subjects of our survey, making sure that we're not doing any harm. It's also making sure that we are being responsible in how we collect the data, and then also how we report the data. Why are ethical considerations important? In terms of surveys, what's important is that we don't affect the data. Obviously, we want to treat people right, but we also want to make sure our personal beliefs and biases are not influencing the data. The examples given in the question are really good too. So, for example, maybe you're doing research on abuse or rape. Well, these are very sensitive subjects, and if you're picking subjects that have had this experience, there could be some implications and harm done. Also talks about if you're doing research to change policy and you don't um, do it accurately, then you could create some bad policies that may impact people ultimately. Who ensures research is ethical? There's something called the Institutional Review Board. This was created in 1974 for regulating research with human beings, and it still exists today. There's an example in here of the Tuskegee study, which is becoming pretty famous and has been talked about specifically because of the COVID virus as well and the vaccine, where the Tuskegee study studied syphilis in black men and continued the study even after a cure was found and not giving men that cure. And so, there's a number of reasons why it's important we just talked about. And the Institutional Review Board is kind of the police, if you will, of research. And each university that does federal research has their own Institutional Review Board. And you can't get funding for your research until you've had their approval. Research projects involving human subjects must be submitted to a university's IRB for approval prior to engaging. This includes the design, the instrument, how they're going to collect data, who they're collecting it from, etc., including a statement of the risks and benefits for potentials. What is the process to submit a survey study? Each university's web page has links, it says, and a process for doing that. I'm not going to go much into that. What is informed consent? This is where your subjects agree to participate in the survey once giving some information about it. Typically, this is done by them signing a form, but depending upon confidentiality, there may be other reasons not to get them to sign a form if you want them to be anonymous. Confidentiality and anonymity are two possible ways that researchers can maintain the privacy of participants. Anonymity is when participants' names are not linked in any way. And confidentiality is handled in different ways because is usually used when you have a longitudinal study or a study over time and you need the same people. So you might assign a number to everyone, etc. What are the ethical concerns for collecting and analyzing data? So here they're talking about fabrication and falsification. Fabrication is when you create data sets, and falsification is when you manipulate the data. And one of the most famous that I've ever heard about, and it's listed in this question, is the doctor that falsified data and said that vaccinations were linked to children getting autism. And this was a huge issue for probably a decade or two until it was finally shown that the doctor that had done the study had falsified information. We continue reading in 100 questions, continuing number 16 through 32, which is in section part 3, selecting a sample. Who is asked to take a survey? One important aspect of the survey research involves defining the population. We define the population for each study. First, we have to figure out who is pertinent or relevant to answering the question of our research question. And then we want to figure out the population that we want to generalize it to. What is a sample and sampling? A sample is a subset of the population of individuals needed to answer a research question, and sampling is simply the process of collecting a sample from the population. So for example, we might want to interview women. So we would take a representative sample of women from the population, maybe perhaps across different races, etc. What is a sampling frame? Drawing a probability sample starts by enumerating all members of the population. We call this list of all population members a sampling frame. For example, if we were collecting a sample of U.S. states, our sampling frame would consist of the full population of U.S. states, which of course there's 50. How do we know if a sample is large enough? Now, the next few questions we're going to get into some statistics and mathematical calculations, and I do want you to read through these, but I'm not expecting you to be statisticians, okay? So kind of understand the concepts and, you know, some of the numerical stuff in there, but again, you don't need to be a statistics major, okay? So here we're asking, like, if, you know, we're not going to survey all of the women in a population, like all the women in America. So we're going to do a sample of that and then hopefully be able to generalize that to women in America. So how do we know if we survey enough women? And what we're saying here is how large of a sample is needed in order to answer the question with statistical significance. And there's a whole calculation here that's talking about the alpha criterion and the beta criterion. So these are pretty straightforward as far as conceptually. So the alpha criterion represents the risk of falsely rejecting a relationship when there is one. So perhaps our survey sample is too small and we don't see a relationship in that sample, but maybe one does exist if we had a larger sample. And so that's the idea of the alpha criterion. The reverse problem is known as the beta, when we find a relationship where none really exists. So we're projecting something different. So here it's talking about how do you figure out the likelihood of doing either of these, creating the alpha effect, rejecting something that really does exist, or the beta effect of projecting a relationship that is not there. Again, you do not need to know this calculation. How does probability work? Probability simply measures the likelihood that an event will occur out of all the possible outcomes. So you roll a die, and you know a die is a six-sided cube, one with the numbers 1 through 6 on it. What's the probability that you'll roll a 3? Well, there's only a 3 on one side, but there are 6 sides. You have a 1 out of 6 probability that you will roll a 3. And that's all that probability is. It's the likelihood that something will occur. What is sampling theory? Sampling theory tells us that if we do our experiment an infinite number of times and plot all of the data, we would get a bell-shaped curve that is representative of the population as a whole, as well as our sample population, okay? That it would be the same. Now, did you hear that? If we did our survey an infinite number of times. What that's saying is if we survey everyone, then we're going to find the median. So, but sampling theory also is telling us that the mean of a sample distribution is a good unbiased estimate of the general population mean as well. Okay. The central limit theorem states that as the sample size approaches infinity, the mean of the sampling distribution approaches the normal bell-shaped curve. Okay. So this theorem is telling us that the sample size is very important because the larger the sample, the closer we get to the actual number, the true number that represents the population. The general rule of thumb here is that it gives some general rules of thumb as far as how sampling should occur, how many there should be in a sampling. What is a random sampling error? A random sampling error is the difference between the actual population mean for the entire population and the mean of the variable, the sample mean or the mean of the sample that we took. So if we interviewed all women for their favorite color in America and 58% said red, and if we interviewed 500 of them as a sample and 49% said red, then our random error would be the difference between those two numbers. What are the types of probability samples? There are three main types of probability samples: simple random sampling, in which each person in the population is listed on a sampling frame. A stratified sampling, random sampling, is a variation on this and guarantees that the distribution of the sample will exactly reflect the population on whatever character is used. So, for example, if we wanted to sample Americans, and I think they use race here in this question, we want, for the stratified example, we want the percentages of people in our sample to match the percentages of the races in our country, for example. So if there are 42% Caucasian people in America, then we'd want our sample to have 42%, and the same with the other races. And so that's the idea of the stratified. A cluster sample is used when we can't create a sampling frame of the population of interest, but we can for some organization which the population is clustered. And here they give the example, we can't find all third graders, but we can find all elementary schools and then find third graders. How is a simple random sample calculated? So the idea of a simple random sample is we would just collect all the possible people we want to collect or possible subjects and then randomly pick them. So the idea here is if we wanted to figure out the states using that example again, we'd put all the name of each state in a bowl, and then if we wanted a sample size of 10, we'd pick out 10 at random. It's random because chance is the only thing predicting which population or which individual actually gets picked. What is a stratified random sampling? A proportionate stratified sample selects a sample that is the same distribution as the population in the stratifying variable, for example, race before. A disproportionate stratified sample, on the other hand, purposefully does not match the population distribution on the stratifying variable. One reason to use a disproportionate sample is to ensure all groups, even small groups, are included in the sample. So the way they explain it here is if there's only 2% of Native Americans in our population as in general, but if we only put 2% of the sample as Native Americans, that wouldn't be statistically relevant. So we want a larger percentage of those. How is proportionate stratified probability sample collected? Again, this is the idea that you would collect data in the numbers that represent the population. I think I'm answering some of these questions in the other one, like for example, when it said, what are the probability types? And this is similar here. We might just determine that we want to collect, instead of 2% of our sample for Native Americans, we're actually going to collect 5% or something like that to make it more. Obviously there has to be a purpose behind why we would do that. Maybe we want to get the opinions of all racial groups. How do we make a disproportionate stratified sample representative? So the idea here is you've collected this data, but you can't say, okay, now this represents the opinions of the entire population, because again, you've counted more of one group than is actually there. And so it's using a multiplier that's really the reverse of the proportion that that party is. So if 2% is of the population is Native American, but you selected 10%, then you would invert that and multiply. Again, what I want you to do is understand the concepts here. I'm not expecting you to take a math class to do this. If it gets, if you get into a complicated survey that's going to have difficult statistical numbers to crunch, you're going to have a statistician as part of your team. How is a subcluster sample collected? This is the one about the third grade class, okay? So the idea here is you would, cluster sampling takes two stages, you sampling of the cluster, which was the schools, and then a sampling of the people within the selected cluster, which was the third graders. How do we select a sample if population is not easy to find? This is kind of an interesting one. Some populations, such as the homeless or the marginalized, and they use drug users and drug dealers, are not easy to find. So how do we do that? Well, they said there's four different non-probability sampling techniques. The first is called convenience sampling. Literally, maybe go to a homeless shelter and start interviewing people. Find out where these people are convenient to survey. A quota sample is a convenient sample that builds variability into the sample by having quotas. Market research is the best of this. They might want to make sure that they interview half women and half men as the example. The third type is a judgment sample or a purposeful sample. This is a type of convenience sample where the researcher is interested in a particular type of knowledge. They use the example, if we're talking about hiring practices, then we're going to ask HR managers. The fourth is called the snowball sampling method or respondent driven. And this is a chain referral. This one's kind of interesting. So you find one homeless person, you survey them, and then you ask them to introduce you to others. Finally, what is the response rate? The response rate is simply the percentage of the selected sample that completes the survey or the ratio of those who agree. So if you have 1,000 people and only 500 answer, then you have a response rate of 0.5, the number that responded over the entire population of your sample. Okay, so I just hit on the highlights here. You do need to read this. I did not give you everything you need. So make sure you pay attention to this. And again, don't focus too heavily on the math, but try to get the concepts out of those questions. Our next readings are for this module are from the book 52 Things About Customer Analytics. We're looking at chapters 18 through 24, starting in chapter 3 with collecting data. Chapter 18 is about fake data, and it gives a number of examples where they've created fake data or used fake data either in training or they didn't get enough data and they had to supplement it, and for some kind of illustrative purpose, but then the data actually got released as if it was realistic. The example, they use a number of examples in here, so read through that. But basically they're saying make sure that you're using data that is real, that is not fake. And again, there's good reasons to use fake data for training and etc., but just make sure it's not made up. Number 19 is interesting, and take your time reading through this because I think it's really relevant. Again, I'm recording this in early 2021 when we've just gone through COVID and some difficult times around the election, etc. And this is talking about data privacy, and it says the tagline is that almost everyone gladly shares their data when they get something. But a lot is written about data privacy and governments and others increasingly active in creating rules governing data privacy. And what they're suggesting here that while people say they want privacy, if they get a benefit from sharing their data, then they're more likely to share it. And they use an analogy here of reducing spam. But also current research or exposure is suggesting that part of the divide in America right now is that people are getting, search engines are finding out what you are reading i.e. news, and then providing you more news that's similar in nature, whether it's from the same publication or publications that are of like mind. Well, the problem with that is you get like-minded news, which is not necessarily an objective reporting on the news as a whole. So this one's an interesting one where they kind of advocate that, oh, it's not a big deal because you don't want to get spam. Again, read that, and I'm curious what you would think about that. So our next set of data, our next chapters are from section 4, understanding data. This discusses the critical need to understand your data, what information the respondent was really providing. And this is interesting. Think about what question they answered, which is not necessarily the question you asked. And so let's look at that. Seeing but not understanding. Context matters. Our conclusions are influenced by our perspectives, even if we aren't aware of it. Again, very timely to the middle of the COVID crisis we're currently in. But context is regularly forgotten in research and analysis, especially in international research, where people often forget that they are viewing things through their own lenses, and that may be very different in another country or culture. And the example they use here is a mask, and why is a person wearing a mask? Now, last year, if you asked this in America, we'd have probably thought, oh, she's a doctor. They give a number of different reasons why people wear masks. If it's in Hong Kong, they say it's because SARS has appeared. If it's in India, they might be part of a religious sect that doesn't want to kill any insects, all sentient beings, etc. If it's in Tokyo, it's likely the person has a cold and is trying to protect others. So it's a really great example of how we can misconstrue the answers to questions because we don't understand the context that people are answering them from. Number 21, Coke is a what? What category am I in? Beware of categorizations. They can distort your conclusions. Here they use an example about Coke as well. So if we asked about Coke in America, we were talking about soda or carbonated beverages, consuming, etc. But sometimes category definitions blind us to the real competitive set. So make sure your categories truly reflect the consumer's competitive set. And here they talk about how they were trying to analyze how Coke was doing in China versus other developing countries because it was so low. And then they realized that in China specifically that beverages were not drunk, I guess, sorry, at meals, that it was very uncommon to serve a meal with a beverage. And so they had to kind of recalibrate their category to figure out how to answer their question. Number 22, GER, data without meaning is mean data. All this is talking about is that it's important for you to understand your data before using it, and it might not mean what you think it does. And this doesn't just mean how people responded to the question, but also the methods of collecting the data as well. And so they give some good analytics in here, or some good examples of how it can be misconstrued. Okay, one of them was that if you went in to a website and stayed there maybe, let's say, 5 minutes, and then you just closed down your internet search, Google Analytics would say that you had been on that website for 0 seconds. Yet you were there for 5 minutes. Now, why is that? Because the way they collect data is by timestamps. And so they know when you went into that website, but since you didn't go to a second page, they don't have a second timestamp to see how long you were there. And so it's a great example to show that you have to be careful about how you collect data, as well as what people are answering. Number 23, beware of people sneaking in the back door. This was really talking about, a lot of this was about digital versus
brick and mortar stores. The tagline is retailers need to differentiate between a more controlled physical shopping experience and a less controlled online experience. In a store can arrange things. They can put things in the window. They can arrange aisles so you have to walk through, etc. But when you're online, you may have actually even got into a store because you did a search on another engine, so it doesn't take you to the home page. It takes you directly to the product page. And so what they're suggesting here is that every entry point needs to be as valuable or construed as just as valuable. And then the last one, and some data is just crap. Consider the source and the quality of data before using it. This is a good one as well, because they give a number of good examples of how they were missing data and they didn't realize it, or the answers to data didn't make any sense. And sometimes they could figure it out and sometimes they couldn't. But really kind of questioning your data and what does it mean, and is there things missing? And so it's another important one, especially when you're thinking about data in terms of providing insight to companies around customer analytics. So again, we've covered a lot of material, and I want to give you a little break. Maybe just hit pause, stand up, stretch, go get a coffee, go get a cookie, step outside. It's a good idea to take breaks, especially when you have longer videos like this. And I know that they're not necessarily that enjoyable. So I have just some quotes here about maybe, again, giving your brain a shower from sampling today. Your attention, please. No one is coming to save you. This life of yours is 100% your responsibility. Accept responsibility for your actions. Be accountable for your results. Take ownership of your mistakes. Big one, big one. Accepting complete responsibility for your life means that you refuse to make excuses or blame others for anything in your life that you're not happy about. You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today. So again, hit pause, and when you're ready, continue on for the rest of the lecture. Our first Canvas material is a glossary of definitions around sampling and the importance of. This shouldn't take you long, but again, spend some time here. They're very simple definitions, and they use good examples, and there's a lot of terms here, probably about 15 or so. So in Canvas, we have a number of information here, and be careful with this page. This is our second Canvas content, and it is a long page. There's quite a bit of information, but it's in brief packets, so don't get overwhelmed by this. There's a short video on what is sampling and why is it important, and then there's a large amount of content about sampling and population, the different types of sampling, some problems with it, some bias, looking at different validity models, etc. So a page through this, take your time. There are great examples. You need to know this information. And while you're going through this, be thinking about your hypothesis for your sampling project and what methodology you're going to use to sample your audience. The next Canvas material is basic statistics concepts, and before you panic, don't worry, we're not expecting you to be statisticians. There's just some basic information here on averages, the mean, the median, and the mode, and what these mean, and then some implications for sampling errors and errors in your data. It's very short. Again, make sure you take notes on this. And make sure you know the difference between the mean, the median, and the mode. These are really good. You want to know all three of these, and when you're interpreting your survey data, you want to look at each of them on your measures to see if there's a big variance, or if one of them seems to make better sense depending upon how your data comes out. And there's good examples in this slide. So another really important piece of Canvas information is the pages on reliability and validity. Um, Reliability is checking your method. Um, if a different surveyor used the same method as you, would they get the same results, basically? Validity is really checking that what you're measuring is actually answering your questions. Are you really measuring what you think you're measuring, or is it, something close but not quite there? Great information in here, not very long, and very, very important to your survey project. The next piece of information in Canvas is creating a representative sample. And it's an example, and it's very clear, it's very quick to go through. Um, and so I think this would be really good for you as well, as far as in terms of your sample project, your survey project. It's very clear. Walk through it. If you have any questions, reach out. Then we come to probability versus non-probability sampling. And really this is just, the icing on the cake. You've got a lot of material and concepts in this module. And so these are two very short articles that help you understand a little bit better the differences between probability and non-probability, and when and where to use them. And our last materials in this model are, again, really just going a little bit deeper. There's a really short video about sampling. Probably tired of hearing about it by now if you've hit this, because this is at the end of the module, and some sampling terminology that may go a little bit deeper than what we've seen in the glossary, etc. So these aren't long times to look at. Browse through them, and if you already have the knowledge, you're good to go. Otherwise, these are maybe helpful to kind of clarify concepts.